Hello, everyone, and welcome to Research Area series. Today's topic is Material Culture and Object Studies in English Literature. It examines how objects, artifacts, and the physical environment contribute to meaning within literary texts. This field explores how literature uses objects to convey identity, memory, social class, power dynamics, consumer culture, and historical context. By focusing on things from clothing and jewelry to furniture and architecture, this approach seeks to understand the symbolic and emotional weight objects carry, as well as their role in shaping human experience. Key themes in material culture and object studies. First one, objects as extensions of identity. Objects in literature often reflect characters' identities, interests, and values, shaping how they perceive themselves and how others perceive them. Example in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gatsby's lavish mansion, expensive clothes, and car are symbols of his constructed identity and desire for social acceptance. Next theme, memory and nostalgia. Literature often uses objects as vessels of memory with personal items such as, serving as reminders of past experiences, relationships, and lost loved ones. For example, Beloved by Toni Morrison uses physical objects like the reminiscence of the sweet home plantation to represent traumatic memories of slavery and loss. Third theme, social class and economic status. Material possessions often indicate a character's social or economic status and reflect broader class distinctions within a society. For example, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen illustrates social class through estates, fashion, and modes of transportation which separate the Bennet family from the wealthy Bingleys and Darcys. Fourth theme is power and colonization. In post-colonial literature, objects taken from or imposed upon colonized cultures can reflect the violence and culture imposition of colonial rule. They also serve as symbols of resistance. For example, in Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, objects like religious icons and Western clothing mark cultural shifts and conflicts brought by colonial rule in Nigeria. Next is consumer culture and modernity. Some texts critique consumerism, exploring how material goods shape personal values, relationships, and the sense of self in modern societies. Example, in American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, designer brands and expensive commodities reflect the shallow consumerism of Patrick Bateman's life and highlight the emptiness beneath his materialistic obsession. Next theme is objects as symbols of trauma and loss. Literature frequently portrays objects that symbolize trauma, death, or grief, acting as physical manifestations of emotional or psychological suffering. The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro uses Darlington Hall and the objects within it to signify lost time and unfulfilled aspirations. The next theme is domesticity and gender roles. Everyday household objects in literature often signify gender roles, especially in works where domestic spheres reflect the limitations or expectations placed on women. Example, in The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the wallpaper itself becomes a symbol of the protagonist's confinement and her mental breakdown, critiquing the oppressive domestic roles imposed on women. And the next theme is objects and rituals. Ritual objects in literature, from wedding rings to religious icons, convey cultural, spiritual, or personal significance. For example, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien centers on the One Ring, an object that holds immense power and symbolizes the corrupting influence of ambition and desire. So, now let's see some of the notable works and authors in material culture and object studies. Of course, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, Middlemarch by George Eliot, Orlando by Virginia Woolf, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, Beloved by Toni Morrison, A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, White Teeth by Zadie Smith. Next, let's see the critical approaches in material culture and object studies: phenomenology, semiotics, Marxist theory, postcolonial theory, gender and feminist theory, and eco-criticism. Now, the notable scholars and theorists in material culture and object studies: Bill Brown, Arjun Appadurai, Bruno Latour, Daniel Miller. Key terms related to material culture and object studies: material culture, object agency, artifacts, commodity fetishism, collecting and hoarding, consumption, domestic objects, ephemeral objects, memorabilia and souvenirs, thing theory, cultural artifacts, symbolism in objects, technological artifacts, luxury versus necessity, antiques and heirlooms, relics and sacred objects, clothing and fashion, eco-materialism, spatial objects, textiles and fabrics, interpersonal objects, body as object, memorialization, death and decay. Now, research topics related to this area. First one, the role of domestic objects in representing gender and identity in Victorian literature. Examine how household items convey themes of femininity, domesticity, and social expectations in 19th century novels. Next, commodity fetishism and class in the novels of Charles Dickens. Analyze how Dickens uses material objects to critique class disparity and consumerism in Victorian England. The symbolism of clothing in modern literature. Explore how clothing functions as a symbol of identity, class, and transformation in modernist text. Next topic, objects of memory and loss in Holocaust literature. Investigate how objects are used to represent memory, trauma, and survival in Holocaust narratives. Next, objects as agents of change in Gothic literature. Study the supernatural influence of objects in Gothic fiction and their role in advancing plot and suspense. Next, the cultural significance of artifacts in post-colonial literature. Explore how post-colonial authors use cultural artifacts to reflect identity, resistance, and heritage. Next, the representation of ephemeral objects in romantic poetry. Analyze how romantic poets use temporary items such as flowers or letters to express fleeting emotions or beauty. Next, antiques and heirlooms as symbols of family legacy in Southern Gothic literature. Examine the symbolism of inherited items in Southern Gothic fiction and their link to family heritage and decay. Material culture and memory in post-Second World War literature. Explore how post-war novels use objects as symbols of trauma, remembrance, and reconstruction. Next, eco-materialism in contemporary climate fiction. Study how contemporary literature uses objects to address ecological themes, focusing on the environmental impacts of material culture. Next, the role of collecting in the detective fiction of the early 20th century. Analyze how collecting and cataloging objects reflect the detective psychological state and narrative style. Next, thing theory and object agency in Shakespeare's plays. Investigate the active role of objects like the handkerchief in Othello and their impact on character decisions and outcomes. Next, objects of disguise and deception in Renaissance drama. Examine how objects such as masks and costumes facilitate themes of identity and deceit in Renaissance plays. Next, luxury and necessity in 18th century British novels. Study how literature of this period contrasts luxury and basic needs to highlight tensions, and class tensions and moral lessons. Next, technological artifacts in dystopian literature. Analyze the role of technology and its artifacts in shaping dystopian societies, focusing on the themes of control and dehumanization. Next, objects as relics of trauma in Native American literature. Explore how objects such as beads or ceremonial items represent trauma, resilience, and cultural heritage in Native American stories. Next, interpersonal objects as symbols of power in French courtly literature. Investigate how items exchanged between characters signify power, loyalty, and influence in French courtly tales. Next, transformation of the body as object in science fiction. Study how the human body is objectified or modified, reflecting themes of technology and identity in science fiction. Next, clothing as a marker of social justice in Jane Austen's novels. Analyze how Austen uses clothing to depict social class, identity, and character traits in her novels. And last topic, religious objects and spiritual conflict in medieval literature. Examine the role of religious artifacts in medieval texts and how they reflect societal beliefs and conflicts. That's all for today. Thank you.